down there quite frequently. How are you?
we have a hard stop here after this panel at 5:15, and I will hold us to that hard stop. I'd like to first of all say Dume Long, Sani Bonani, Hoye Mitag to all of our South African attendees here today. My name is Tony Carroll, and I'm delighted to be the moderator of this program today that will focus this panel on South Africa, the next 20 years, the role of technology, business, and entrepreneurship. I've also delighted to have been a member of the Board of Advisors for the SAWIP program here in Washington. I've seen it grow from strength to strength and commend all of its leadership and role of advisors and directors in making this really a terrific initiative. I think those initiatives that really preach to the new South Africa, the new generation, are important initiatives for all of us to support. And Steve and I share one thing in common. We both first went to South Africa in 1976. I arrived in South Africa in May 1976, and I was posted to Botswana as a Peace Corps volunteer. As a Peace Corps volunteer, I was in training, and one of our classmates, our fellow trainees, had a death in his family, and I was elected to drive that person to Johannesburg, the old Jan Smuts International Airport, to fly back to Botswana. And I happened to be staying back then. You couldn't cross the border back into Botswana after about 6 o'clock in the evening. So I had to stay over in Joburg Park, which all of you may remember is in Hillbrow. And I stayed at the old Johannesburger Hotel, which Ines knows well. And I happened to stay there the night of the Orlando West riots in Soweto. And it was like a shot rang out through South Africa. You just knew that something momentous had happened. And of course, over the course of the next 2.5 years living in Botswana and being on the border of Botswana, being a district officer in Botswana, interviewing refugees as they crossed the border into Botswana seeking political asylum, you got the flavor and nature of what was happening in South Africa in a very first-hand perspective. It certainly galvanized my interest as a young man in South Africa's history, and it's been my great fortune to have been involved in the last 35 years of doing business and being involved in philanthropy and other measures in South Africa to try to help continue its great path, and it's not say without its bumps along the road, its great path to becoming a modern and open society that it is now. I'm fortunate to have a really terrific panel here that will certainly tell you more about South Africa and their important work therein in the coming minutes. You have all their biographic information here before you, so I won't belabor you with the redundancy of repeating that. But I do think we really are honored to have a terrific panel. Ines Banda is a distinguished lawyer who's practiced here in the United States and in South Africa. I first came across his name in 1995 when I led a delegation of the American Bar Association. I'm a lawyer and was at that point chairman of the ABA's Africa Committee. To South Africa and have followed his career, and his remarks in past events have struck me as being not only extremely profound but also well measured. Donna Katzen, I've followed for the last 20 or 30 years. She's really a terrific leader in social entrepreneurship. Her work with shared interest, and I welcome all of you to get a brochure or annual report in the back, is truly a monumental undertaking, and the accomplishments have just been spectacular in the last 20 years, and how much she's made a difference, and particularly in underserviced parts of the South African economy. Maya Ajmera, who I've just met, and I welcome her to the panel. We are fellow teachers at Johns Hopkins. She's a visiting scholar. I'm an adjunct professor in the Africa Studies program, as well as a senior associate at CSIS, which Jennifer Cook leads the Africa program in. Maya has been doing some terrific work in the Global Fund for Children, and also really a leading social entrepreneur with this particular interest in technology and the role of technology in improvement of societies. And then lastly, we have Dick America, Professor Richard America, who's an old friend of mine, who's been working in leadership, business leadership, and government leadership in South Africa for many years. Now he uses the perch as a professor at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown, and he has made enormous contributions to the success in integrating Africa into that established and very honored faculty there. And every year, for the past several years, he's brought a group of his graduate students to South Africa, which I've had the opportunity to brief before they've gone out to understand and examine the opportunities for business in South Africa. He's also been at the fore in leading integrating the areas of business education in Southern Africa. So without any further ado, I'd like to turn the panel over to Eunice Banda to talk a little bit maybe from the sort of the formal education side of South Africa. Then I'd like to talk to Donna and talk particularly about meeting some of the needs and the underserved elements of that economy. Maya will talk a little bit about the role of social entrepreneurship and technology. And then Richard will offer his comments on not only business education and entrepreneurship, but some of the other important work that he's done. So without any further ado, let me turn it over to Eunice, and then we'll certainly leave enough room for Q&A. We'll end it at 5:15, so if our participants can limit their remarks to 10 or 12 minutes, so that we'll leave ample room for discussion. And at the end, when you answer a question, ask a question, get the mic, and stand up. We're being taped, so that we really have a rich evidence or history for this event. So without any further ado, Eunice, over to you.
Thanks. Nice introduction. I'm South African. I moved to Washington last year in June. My responsibility today is to discuss the business community in the context of the last 20 years of South African democracy and to look forward into the future. To set a context for that discussion, it is important to reflect on how the business community found itself at the commencement of democracy. When democracy finally dawned in South Africa, it found the business community withdrawn. It was in its shell, pummeled by global sanctions, pummeled by the unavailability of capital for expansion, and very insular. It was in a shaken economy. During that time leading to democracy and prior to democracy, the apartheid government had put in place severe systems, desperate systems of capital and exchange control, such as the much-hated financial rand, which was a dual currency system designed essentially to stem the then irresistible urge by South African businesses to engage in capital flight out of the country. In short, South African businesses, entrepreneurs, and innovators were locked in, held hostage, and they were locked down and in a state of commercial despair. So within this depressing state of affairs, entrepreneurs who had ideas and always would, they applied their minds to dealing with the restrictions and the circumstances they found themselves in, and they grew some homegrown industries. A new breed of what I call a wartime entrepreneurship started to emerge in South Africa. They sprang into action and took advantage of the retreating banks, institutions that were leaving South Africa in the height of sanctions. Some of the banks that today we take for granted, like Standard Bank, Absa Bank, were born out of this period. Standard Bank was formed from the shell of Barclays retail network when Barclays actually exited the market. The South African government also was very desperate in maintaining a military hegemony around South Africa in the Southern African region, and it dusted up old and abandoned technologies like the Fischer-Tropsch technology for converting coal to liquid fuel, which was developed in 1925 in Germany before the Second World War. And in that, it found an alternative to the sanctions which were building up and the difficulty of accessing fuel from the international community. This environment spread an undercurrent of illegality in South African operations. So for most businesses which had an international component, whether as exporters or importers of any goods, there was an immorality of sorts that was starting to set in. There were intermediaries who were willing to bust sanctions. And in fact, the South African business community was a pariah community alongside that of its state. So when apartheid finally came to an end in 1994, it brought with it a mixed blessing because it had found that the business community had lost its dignity in the international community. The blessings are very easy to see. With the end of apartheid, it enabled the international community to remove the numerous sanctions, and it allowed South African businesses to be able to find international capital and international market, and the domestic market actually opened up for competition. This is the part which actually was a real mixed blessing in that for the period of apartheid, most South African companies were no longer experienced or had known the reality of international competition. They were insulated. They did not have to worry about maintaining market share against global trade, as well as global technologies and ways of doing business. Competition became very stiff for South African businesses, but they rose to the occasion. As you know, today, South Africa, in terms of global competitiveness, has some of the best financial services institutions in the world. So when the story of South Africa's economic performance over the last 20 years is told, and Colin Coleman and others have spoken about it eloquently, it needs to be viewed in the backdrop of where it was before that 20-year period actually started, the rapid transformation of business that needed to take place, and the innovation that had to be made to get South Africa to where it is today. That story of 20 years is told very well, and in most instances is told with an incredible amount of passion. It is a euphoric story, told with a deep sense of pride and sometimes even a hint at miracles at work. There are also storytellers of that 20 years of democracy who caution that our aggregate economic numbers, the 33% in GDP per capita growth, and the quadrupling of our economy over that period of time, do not tell the full truth. That South Africa's growth has been skewed in favor of an already privileged minority, that there have been many, many missteps by a government which is not fully holding itself accountable for the excesses of power that are constantly experienced, that crime is rampant, that economic growth is not robust enough to address what still has to be done. When we look at this story, they justly caution that our euphoria, the euphoria of the last 20 years, the miracle and the economic growth that we have seen is perhaps unwise, and that maybe it represents a willful blindness to the disparity in wealth that is glaring at us and fast gnawing at the South African storybook emergence into democracy. This is the other narrative, the other truth of our 20 years. There are also other storytellers who say that forget about the past and let's look ahead. They use the story of these last 20 years to invent a crystal ball from which we can maybe discern the future and see where we may be. It is usually a future which is made up of binary possibilities. One possibility is a glorious utopian outcome of well-being and unbounded economic growth and possibility. The other possibility is of a dire and even diabolical nation consuming itself in an orgy of consumer boycotts, devastating economic decline, and social fracture. So when I was asked to reflect about the 20 years of business and where we may find ourselves, I had to choose which one of these three narratives, the great euphoria, the crystal ball of a binary future, or the past from which we came. But today, we are at the Woodrow Wilson Center, which is the president of this country. And today we are celebrating a future generation of leaders who actually we look to for the future that we hope for and that we aspire to. So it is only fitting that I must choose the story of leadership, for none of the ones that I've explained really capture what must happen next. In my mind, I strongly believe that the past and the future are bound by a single constant, which is that it is shaped by the will of men and women who, driven by the desire to do good, actually can bend and do bend history, and they can bring the future forward and mold it into the present that we want. We have seen leadership in the South African business community, which when we look back, expected just such a transformation for the future that now we celebrate today. You have seen innovators like Mark Shuttleworth take their place in the global community. You have seen an embrace of the transformation of the economy into an inclusive one, when Anglo-American understood that without including the majority of South African in the economy, that the future of South Africa was not sustainable. We are able to see how the South African business community has risen to the new demands of democracy and absorbed the cost of democracy in order to ensure that its future is better shaped. So when I look at 20 years later and I look at where the business community is, it speaks very much of a paucity of leadership, and it requires an innovation of sorts in relation to how we deal with the challenges that we're faced with. In my mind, South Africa is an innovative country, is a globally competitive country. We have listed successfully companies that have emerged from South Africa: Anglo American, Old Mutual, MTN, one of the largest companies in Nigeria, just to take a little jibe at our African neighbor, is a South African company, MTN. We have solved access to landlines by leapfrogging the wires for mobile telecommunications and technology. We are fully capable. The despair that is beginning to visit us, I think, is a despair of a lack of leadership, and what the business community cries for. It's not a leadership in government, but in my view, it needs a leadership within itself. Because what is required and what is necessary in my mind is a leadership that recognizes full citizenship and entitlement and a right to engage a government in what the next generation and the next future is going to look like. I am reminded of a story by two professors, Asemoglu and Robinson, about why nations fail. It is a story of South and North Korea. There was a time once, before 1950, that Korea was a single country. It was a colony of Japan. When it was put under administration, the South, after the Second World War, when Japan surrendered, the South was administered by the United States and the North was administered by Russia. When the two countries fought, it actually created a permanent division of the one country into two parts. Today, South Korea represents the best that is possible in terms of the emergence of an economy, from the despair of war to one of the greatest competitors to even American technology companies like Apple. And the North is a darkened space, devoid of democracy, devoid of the possibility and the hope that this group of young people today holds for the future of South Africa. The commonality that was missing between the South and North was the resilience of institutions that enabled nations to provide a predictable path through which talent can be captured and directed towards the future that we desire. And I believe that the business community, shaped by future leaders like yourselves, the members of the class of 2014 of SAWIP, can find in itself the possibility of engaging that government, not as an outsider, but as a partner, to build the capacity that is sorely needed to challenge and to frame the debate in a manner that provides uniform hope across that country in relation to future generations finding a place, which makes the next 20 years the determination that we can make today. Thank you.
Done.
Thanks.
Done. Perfect.
The year is 1994. Archbishop Tutu reflects on the past and the future, and he says to the international community, the end of apartheid was part one of the struggle, but part two is the more difficult, to make the miracle endure. He said, we asked you to disinvest. Now we say to you, invest, make South Africa succeed for the sake of the world. Some of us took him literally. And for many people who had been working in the anti-apartheid movement, who had been helping and working with companies to press for a peaceful end of apartheid by pressuring, by isolating the South African economy, a number of those investors turned to look for ways to put money back into South Africa, but not necessarily into the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, which they knew other people would put money into, but rather into the grassroots communities with which they had partnered in working against apartheid for so many years. So Shared Interests, the organization that I work with, was born at that time. And we were looking for a way to develop an investment strategy to unlock the financial and human capital in South Africa itself. So we created an investment fund, albeit a nonprofit investment fund, and we use the money that we borrow to guarantee the loans that we get mainstream lenders, big banks in South Africa, to make to low-income communities of color, so that yesterday's unbankable borrowers become today's ordinary business. And I'll say more how that works. But as we look back at this 20 years, the first 20 years in South Africa's transformation, we look at the country's tremendous achievements, some of which Colin Coleman talked about, not only the growth rate, the housing, the electricity, the fact that 95% of the people in the country now have access to clean water, but also strategies that looked at and lifted up business from the bottom up. Now, bear in mind, this is a huge challenge because the majority of South Africans were barred from doing business, barred from owning land outside of the homelands, barred from the kinds of education and skills development that would be required by a legal system, as well as years of colonial rule. And so overcoming that legacy is an enormous, enormous challenge. Nonetheless, with a national development plan, with the charters, codes, the broad-based Black economic empowerment systems, with land reform, with the development of local supply chains, there has been a very concentrated effort and a number of achievements that we can describe in greater detail during the first 20 years. Shared Interest is also celebrating its 20th anniversary and proud of the fact that we have reached 2.2 million low-income Black South Africans, that we've helped to start and expand more than 203,000 micro-enterprises and more than 1,100 small businesses, helped to build more than 120,000 low-cost homes, and create almost 2 million jobs. So we're all celebrating. But we realize that we cannot afford to celebrate because the tremendous, tremendous challenges that call for our attention and South Africa's are just as important as what we've been able to produce in the first 20 years. So the situation, I think, is most dramatically summed up for me by a South African street hawker at the time who said to me in 1994, political freedom without economic freedom is not freedom. And that very telling point is what has driven so much work for the last 2 decades. The unemployment stats that Colin Coleman talked about, the inequality, the Gini coefficient, these remain significant, significant challenges. From the small business perspective, though, just to look at that optic for a minute, when you compare South Africa to other developing, say, BRICS countries, 35% of South Africa's GDP is generated by the small business sector. In countries like India and Brazil, that number is 60%. There's also a low level overall of total entrepreneurship activity, so that the total adult early entrepreneurship activity represents only the activities of 10.6% of South African adults. Now, that is the lowest in sub-Saharan Africa. As a matter of fact, the next competitor, the next lowest country on that range is Botswana with a 20% rating. And that puts them both behind Zambia, Angola, and Malawi. So generating entrepreneurship, period, is an issue and one that continues to challenge South Africa. In rural areas, the challenges are even greater, as has been said, whereas unemployment, official unemployment, not even including discouraged workers, is 25% in South Africa overall. In rural areas, it's 52%. So the challenge of bridging that gap continues to be a structural problem, and one that is increasingly challenging to small businesses. When I say small businesses, I'm also including farms, commercial farms, where there has been an explicit effort over the last 20 years to jumpstart rural economies. So 5,000 families have benefited, more than 5,000 from the land claims, and there has been 10% of South Africa's arable land that has returned to Black hands. The goal was 30% by this point in time. And so struggling to catch up with South Africa's own projections continues to be an enormous challenge. It is also a challenge for those people who do manage to start up farms, whether they're individual farmers, whether they're associations, cooperatives. Many of those farms that have been carefully bought, established, and put into operation are failing for lack of capital, for lack of technical support, and lack of linkages to local and international markets. and continuing challenges. As a matter of fact, the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor announced last year that between 70 and 80% of South Africa's small and growing businesses were in fact in trouble, if not failing. I will say parenthetically that I think the percentage in the United States that I last saw was 80%. So this is not to say that South Africa is unique, but for its own development trajectory, this is a big problem. Microfinance has its own challenges. A number of the MFIs, microfinance institutions in the country that had achieved tremendous promise in the early years, are facing hard times. A couple of the larger ones have gone out of business in the last 2 or 3 years. And so that continues to raise the question of how do you jumpstart businesses from the bottom of the economic ladder? And financial institutions, one more challenge before we get to the opportunities, are facing a particularly challenging time in terms of working with the majority market. First of all, South Africa's banks, unlike banks in some countries, do not have to move down market. They do not have to, for their own economic survival, develop a mass base of small and growing businesses. In fact, if all the banks wanted to do was to continue to profit and to survive economically, they could actually and do quite well investing in local markets and local large businesses and the large big corporate market that exists in South Africa, which does not exist everywhere. So the same forces that drive banks down market in some other African countries are not as strong in South Africa. And in the wake of the global financial crisis 2008, with Basel III requirements, concerns about security and making sure that you have protected your investment and not lent to risky people, has also encouraged banks to be increasingly conservative in the way that they lend. So those are additional challenges, particularly if you are an up-and-coming entrepreneur and you need a loan. That said, there are also tremendous, tremendous opportunities to build a really vibrant, inclusive entrepreneurial ecosystem in South and also Southern Africa. And so when you talk about an ecosystem, you're recognizing that business is not just big business. It's not just national policy about big business, but it is, in fact, everybody in the business chain, from the micro-entrepreneur up to major corporations. And one thing that Shared Interest has been particularly privileged to do is to work with businesses and players who are helping to build that entrepreneurial ecosystem. And I'm just going to mention four entry points and then let everybody's minds go wild about how else this ecosystem can and should be built. The first, our entry point is really forging financial value chains. That is helping to get money to flow from big banks to grassroots communities. We are working with big banks for the same reason that people rob them, which is that's where the money is. So we feel that one of the most sustainable points of change is to enable the money in the largest institutions in the country flow to the majority communities. We do that, just to give you an example. So investors in the United States make loans to Shared Interest. Those loans are invested and deposited in a U.S. bank. Here's how the chain works. The U.S. bank then guarantees a loan that a South African bank makes to a business or, in the microfinance case, a microfinance institution. So the Small Enterprise Foundation in Limpopo, that in 2004 had 18,000 clients but could not get a bank loan, had a 99% repayment rate of Black rural women starting tiny businesses but could not get a bank loan. With a guarantee and guarantees that we continued over a 10-year period, they have not only moved into another 4 provinces, but they've grown from 18,000 women to 110,000 women clients. And they still have a 99.9% repayment rate. And they don't need our guarantees anymore because the bank says, what a good institution, of course. So that is one example of helping the finances flow and helping women on the front lines of their economies and communities build from the ground up. Another kind of value chain has to do with hubs and incubators that are starting small businesses in various places in South Africa. There's one in Philippi how many people know the Western Cape, know where Philippi is? Good. Okay, so you can picture Philippi and this hub that is starting out, small local businesses starting out, and we can talk more about that. Also, Cyril Ramaphosa, you know who Cyril Ramaphosa is. Excellent. Okay, one thing that he has helped to create is called Shanduka Black Umbrellas, which is a hub that operates largely in townships and is helping up-and-coming entrepreneurs start small businesses. So we have guaranteed loans to some of his clients, their clients now, who are starting up and entering the mainstream market and connecting them to that market. Another place that value chains are particularly important are in rural communities, where we have been privileged to work with other NGOs like TechnoServe and through our partner, the Tembani International Guarantee Fund, which provides technical support both to businesses and borrowers. We have helped to enable Black rural women become commercial farmers. You know that women grow most of the food on the continent and in the region. However, when those small farms have markets, when they have contracts, if they have credit, they tend not to be women's anymore. They tend to be businesses, and they tend to be run by men. So this is an effort to bring women into the commercial value chain and helping them connect their crops to local markets with the technical support and credit that would otherwise be very hard to come by. I just want to give you an example of one person, because she is also an example of the next frontier for us, which is working with youth and bringing this model to youth farmers to help address some of that excruciating youth unemployment. As was said before, 73% of the people who are unemployed are under the age of 35. So picture Rafiwa Tsielachitsa. She is near Messina in the northern part of South Africa, about 30K south of Zimbabwe. And she is a woman subsistence farmer who's working on traditional land. She convinces the local chief to allow her to work 15 hectares. And she manages to work this very well on almost a survival basis with not very much outside help. One small government grant. She begins to work with this program through Women's Development Businesses Investment Holdings that provides both technical support and access to credit. She doubles the size of her hectarage. She has a goal of eventually farming 150 hectares.
And in 1 minute, please.
And what she says to me, Rafiwa, who is this tall, she says to me, I see myself in 5 years as helping other young women understand that they can also do this work. I am small. I must do something big. And so to close with a message that from Nelson Mandela, which could have been said directly to this particular SAWIP program, he said, "It is time for the next generation to continue the struggle against social injustice and for the rights of humanity. It is in your hands." Thank you.
Thank you. Maya?
Such a pleasure to be here this afternoon. And as I look to many of you young people, I'm reminded of myself, your age, when I founded the Global Fund for Children. I was 24. And the Global Fund for Children invests small amounts of capital into very innovative grassroots organizations serving the most vulnerable children and youth globally. And I founded the organization with $25,000 in seed capital given by Echoing Green. And I will come back to Echoing Green and some of the stories related to this social venture capital fund founded by a private equity group called General Atlantic Partners. But for me, the journey as a social entrepreneur for 18 years has been extraordinary, where we invested over $35 million in capital and still growing into 600 very innovative grassroots organizations in 80 countries and helping them be scalable and replicable. And we've touched the lives of nearly 9 million children. I let go of Global Fund for Children as the CEO, and now I'm founder, and soon to become CEO of a group called Society for Science and the Public, which really looks at the intersection of science, technology, and innovation. And I'm very, very excited because I think technology is the key, one of the keys to finding new solutions to combat poverty. Now, let me tell you about echoing green a little bit. How many of you have heard of echoing green? Yes? Okay. So Echoing Green was founded by General Atlantic Partners. It was founded in 1988. And they decided they wanted to use private sector principles to solve social problems. And they started making bets on young people like me. They made a bet on Wendy Kopp of Teach for America. How many of you have heard of Teach for America or Teach for All? Okay. And they started going global. A year later, and they funded me, the Global Fund for Children. They funded Disability Rights International. They've funded quite a few very well-known organizations. But in the last 5 years, and I'm now co-chair of that board. I chair the board with Dave Hodgson, who's a partner at General Atlantic. But in the last 5 to 6 years, we have seen something extraordinary happen with young people and technology. That a lot of the applications we get are people using technology to solve social problems. And let me give you some examples of some of those organizations or innovations. And what's amazing is I want you to keep in mind that they are your age. They are between the ages of 22 and 28, maybe 30. Is the end point. So one group is a group called Embrace. And it is a technology that many women have babies and they're underweight and they need warmth. If they don't get the warmth they need, the babies will die. The most common method to use is the kangaroo method, right? You put a baby on your chest and the baby will get warm. Well, this group actually created a thermal baby sleeping bag that actually can be put on the baby to create warmth. What's extraordinary is GE has taken this on as a partner and is now scaling that work. But what's even more amazing is there is a young man out there who has created a bracelet that you put on the child's wrist, and it will tell you automatically, a color will show on the wrist that the baby is cold and needs to be warm. So you may not even need the baby sleeping bag, you may just need to put the baby on your chest. But think about that technology. This young man was a biomedical engineer at Johnson & Johnson. He started seeing this problem and he said, what is the key to the entry point? What could help the most? It's letting the mother know that the baby is cold. And that bracelet will turn a color. Let me tell you about another group called PharmaSecure, started by two 22-year-olds. This group actually is in the continent of Africa, as well as in Asia. But one of the biggest problems in the drug industry is counterfeit drugs. And what PharmaSecure has done is that, on every pill, there's a number on every pill. What they've done is created a mobile technology that you actually enter the number, and you find out if that pill is real or not. I mean, the counterfeit drug industry is quite huge. They have actually now gotten Series A funding from Eric Schmidt of Google and quite a few others. And these two guys are 22 years old, and they have an incredibly brilliant idea, and they're scaling it. Another one is located in Kenya as well as in Rwanda, but it's a group called Mobius Motors. I don't know if you've heard of Mobius Motors, but what is the biggest problem trying to supply goods on roads in the developing world? I mean, what's one of the biggest problems? Trucks, they break down, right? Well, what Mobius Motors did is manufacture and design vehicles that actually can stand the roads of the continent of Africa or these countries, and they're highly affordable. And this young man, who's an MIT graduate, I believe, wants to become the next Ford Motor Company of Africa in this sector. Another young man has started something called Labor Voices. So how many of you in South Africa know that there are labor issues, labor exploitation? Is there labor exploitation in South Africa? Would one say there is? Okay. It is usually everywhere in the developing world. What Labor Voices does is that it connects individuals who work in factories or work in any kind of labor, and is able to provide real-time information about the conditions that they're working in, and if the conditions are good or not. And this became very powerful when, I don't know if you remember the Bangladesh factory fire. If somebody had been able to text somewhere outside that we can't get out, this has been locked, we're done. I mean, these are this real-time information, and technology is allowing you to do that. Another group called Last Mile Health is actually going into the hardest places on Earth, and the continent of Africa is included, and they're in Liberia, but really the farthest corners to give health care. And what they've done is they've created a real interesting technology partnership with technology companies and their cell towers to give that cell power to Last Mile Health, and they've actually trained on the ground health workers who can actually provide real-time data and real-time feedback on their patients. And lastly, I know we're running out of time, is one of the most exciting things that's happening. I'm not a big fan of large institutions. I'm just not. I believe in the power of small grassroots organizations and power of entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurs to make change. But something is coming out of UNICEF that's very cool. It's something called the Innovation Unit. And it started by two young people and using technology. And I'll give two examples, and then I'll be quiet. Do you know that 1 in 3 babies in the world are not registered? They do not have a birth registration. So if you don't have a birth registration, you literally can be stateless. You do not get services. Your identity is lost. One of the things that they've done in Nigeria is they've created a partnership between the mobile company and villages to actually use technology to register children. It's brilliant. Okay, and it's spreading throughout the continent. The other one is doing youth surveys through technology, and these are real-time surveys being done in Uganda about how do you feel about the election coming up? What are your biggest issues going on in your community? This is real-time information and data that they've been able to create. One of the things that they've said to us, or said to me, is, we did this from New York City, trying to create these solutions, and it never worked. We had to listen to people on the ground, and we had to have people there to understand how things work. And I think that's incredibly important in entrepreneurship, that we're on the ground and that we're not somewhere off in the United States telling people what to do. So I think it's an extraordinary time in the field of entrepreneurship. It's an extraordinary time in the field of technology, and how you merge that and how you use it is really, it's an open field.
Thanks. Professor.
There's no more time, so we'll go right to Q&A.
No. We got to hear from you.
I'm going to make 5 quick points, and they're concerned with all of Africa, not just South Africa. And Colin's comments, he's left the room, but there's a theme that runs through, and it has to do with weak management. That weak management is a major constraint on Africa's progress, and the solution is largely in business schools. Now, I have a bias, obviously. I'm in a business school, but I've worked with Gibbs and Wits and Stellenbosch and KwaZulu-Natal and other business schools all over Africa. We believe that strong business schools are drivers not only of improvement in management capacity, but they are incubators of business, they are stimulators of investment, therefore they are drivers of job creation as well. Second is corruption. We haven't really said much about corruption today, but it's a major constraint, well understood all over Africa to be a barrier to investment, enterprise formation, job creation, and progress. The solution here is, among other things, strong business ethics programs in universities. And I've recently joined the Board of Trustees of the West Africa Society on Business Ethics. We're creating business ethics programs at 50 universities in all of ECOWAS. And we hope that over the next 20 years or so, it will have a major impact by creating a new norm in the professional management world that will, year by year, change behavior, public sector and private sector. Third is manufacturing. We've touched on that a bit, but Africa has very weak manufacturing sectors. Creating a modern industrial base is key. Value-added processing and production has to be a priority country by country. Obviously, South Africa has a first world economy in part, but also significant lags for most of the population. But all over Africa, much more attention to the manufacturing sector is crucial, and there are, I would invite you as young people looking to your career options to think about that. If you've been focused on professional services or other kind of services, roll up your sleeves and get to work on the factory floor and make things. Africa needs that. Fourth, and this is a bit of a removed, but I believe a key, Africa has many landlocked countries, others that are artificial because of colonial decisions of one kind or another on their borders. They're too small to be attractive to investors. They are geographically constrained. That has to change. Countries need to merge. Now, we've seen in Sudan just the opposite, and there are forces that drive countries apart. We're seeing it in the Middle East now, perhaps, in real time. But consolidation of countries will be beneficial, and I believe that there are some innovative ways to make that happen that mimic what we do in the corporate world. That is, we merge companies. We can merge corporations by treating them as if they were companies and offering financial incentives to their citizens to give up their citizenship and merge with their neighbors. I won't get into the details now, but if that can happen, we will see larger markets, more efficient political units, and progress. And the fifth is China. We haven't heard about China today, but if we're going to have a discussion on Africa, somewhere in the discussion, somebody needs to mention China. There is, I believe, evidence of a systematic extraction of income and wealth, a transfer or diversion of income and wealth by all sorts of means, leading to an unjust enrichment in China at the expense of Africa. We won't elaborate on that here, but it would be an incomplete discussion if we didn't at least note that this is a problem. You, in the next 50 years in your careers, will be able to face up to that, wrestle with it, and make progress at minimizing it. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Dick. Thank you, Dick, for recognizing that we're running out of time, but not to minimize the profound nature of your 5 points. Good closing comments and sort of frames this discussion. We just have a few minutes for questions. I plan on staying around a little bit this evening, and maybe you'll get an opportunity to ask some of our panelists after the next session if they stick around. I thought the panel was terrific insofar as not only were they great presentations, they were very distinct. There is very little overlap. I always get nervous with 4 panelists. You know, that's always a lot to fit in an hour. And we really did have some very fine and distinct lines among those presentations. So I'm really delighted. We're just going to ask, Ed, you've already asked a question. Anybody here hasn't asked a question? How about our 2, we got our 3 students here. Take them right in order, 1, 2, 3. Right here, we'll start with you. And Ed, if we have a chance, we'll come back to you.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Dalisu Dwacha. I'm part of the SAWIP 2014 team, and I'm studying a Bachelor of Business Science at the University of Cape Town, and I'm currently interning at the IFC, the private sector arm of the World Bank, and that's why this session was really fun and exciting for me. Am I allowed to ask every panelist a quick question?
Just one question. Just one question. Pick your best question or your best panelist, and that's it.
This is tough. Enos, you mentioned that South Africa's got a good story to tell with regards to the resilience of financial institutions and how those institutions need to facilitate the uptake of talent. Now, there's the question of ESCOM, and I understand that you've had involvements with ESCOM. And reading the news today, the Business Day, ESCOM is planning a recapitalization strategy with 3 ministers that Zuma has earmarked to take on this project. I want to hear what your opinions are on ESCOM. What do they need to do to go forward? And they're powering our economy, and we've had issues. So I just want to hear.
Okay, ESCOM. Are you next?
Hello, everyone. My name is Titwanelo, and I'm studying Bachelor of Education at the University of the Western Cape.
Could you stand up? We gotta actually. I'm sorry. You have to stand up and sort of at least acknowledge there's a camera in the back of the room. Sorry.
I'm pretty tall, so it might
That's
be actually
all right.
an issue.
That's all right. You're lovely and tall.
Okay. My name is Titwanelo, and I'm studying education at the University of the Western Cape. I'm part of SAWIP 2014. And my question really is for everyone. It's open to the panel. We hear about innovation and about the economy being talked about a lot in terms of the development of Africa. And being someone, well, I might have a biased opinion in terms of the importance of education based on what I'm studying, but I'd like to know from you, because it's nice to have innovation, it's nice to talk about the economy, it's nice to pump money into Africa, but if we are really to address the developmental issues, how important is education and literacy?
Okay. Enos will take the ESCOM. I'll leave education and importance of literacy, and maybe we talk about financial literacy to Professor America. Go ahead.
Greetings, my name is Chabangizing. I'm currently studying at the University of Cape Town. I'm doing economics and international relations. Actually, my question was directed to Dr. Richard America.
Okay, then maybe you answer the question on the importance of literacy and financial. I'd like to talk about financial literacy as well, but go ahead.
I've been recently reading about the Africa Growth Opportunity Act and the relations between the United States and South Africa. Now, I've heard talks that the United States they have a review about graduating South Africa from the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. Correct me if I'm wrong. And one of the biggest products which South Africa is actually competitive with in terms of the United States is the car manufacturing industry. The car, BMWs and Mercedes-Benz and etc. Now, that constitutes about 6% of South Africa's GDP, if my statistics are correct. And now, should South Africa be graduated from the AGOA project, it might affect 300,000 jobs which are currently being given out in terms of the car manufacturing industry. Now, you speak about China, and you're saying that China not really good for Africa. That's what I've been hearing around. And now I wanted to understand, how is America going to ensure that the relationship between Africa and the United States continues and that job creation continues in South Africa if South Africa is graduated from the Africa Growth Opportunity Act?
Graduation. And Ed Barber, last question, and then we're going to have to go to wrap it up. Ed.
Thanks, Tony. I don't want to hog the floor, but Ms. Katzen raised a very interesting question about land reform. She said, if I heard you right, that it was 10% black now versus a goal of 30%. But as of half a dozen years ago, the government's land reform program, if I recall right, seemed to have hit a dead end. It was underfunded, and they were trying to avoid Zimbabwe-style violence. It seemed to be going nowhere. What has changed?
Okay, everybody's got a question. Ines, let's start with you.
Okay. Whoever raised this ESCOM question probably hates me. A quick point about energy. All countries, there is a correlation between energy inputs and the projections that are placed on the economy going forward. For South Africa, I think the major challenge now, and ESCOM is symptomatic of that issue. ESCOM's actual problems are related to skills, planning, and just a coordination of how South Africa deals with its energy question. And it is consistent with all the issues that have been raised about the ability of the government to administer and manage all systems so that they produce the output that is required. And one of the challenges for ESCOM is that it is a company that was conceived in an environment of limitless state resources where each and every problem could be solved with cash. When it was incorporated, the idea that it needed to be a self-sustaining institution was not incorporated into its the legal structure and the way it goes forward. And most importantly, that it was not subjected to proper market tests and analysis. That's the first point. The second one is that even our energy projections are deliberately ignoring the question of the future sustainability of our energy demand. The president just spoke about a third coal-fired power station when on the other side of the aisle, the World Bank have mentioned that only under very exceptional circumstances would they fund another coal-fired power station. We are talking about an environment of intense climate change debate, which is now leading to direct capital markets implications. So the problem of ESCOM is more symptomatic of the problem of South Africa's inputs and assessment of its economic trajectory. We are still focusing on an energy-intensive growth strategy and an extractive growth strategy, which brings us to Professor Richard America's statement about China. Most of the business ideas are about expanding rail and port infrastructure to export raw materials, when in fact we need to be thinking about a lower energy, high economic intensive in terms of labor and skills. So ESCOM is a symptom rather than an actual manifestation of a problem on a standalone basis. And we can talk more about it later, but that's all.
It's a complicated question with a lot of moving parts. Maya.
So you asked about education, and we can't ignore that. And literacy is absolutely key. One of the things that's happening in the continent of Africa, but happening in Asia as well, is the youth bulge, right? Is the enormity of young people, and what are their prospects for a job, but also their prospects for education. Many go to primary school and then drop out, and don't go to secondary school. But some go to secondary school, and what is their options for higher education? There just isn't enough spaces in the university system. And I think Africa and the continent of Africa, but South Africa in particular, and India have these issues in play right now. The other thing is to reach the most marginalized children in South Africa. The very innovative community-based organizations do an amazing job, and I think they're undervalued and undercapitalized. And we need to provide them more resources to be able to reach these most marginalized children who aren't receiving an education or receiving a poor education. But I think you're right, education and literacy is a very key component to all of this.
Anna.
Okay, the land question in 20 seconds or less. Yes, South Africa is up against an enormous challenge, and the strategy that it's chosen, that for its land reform, the primary strategy of willing seller, willing buyer, means that if you are buying land back from people who are willing to sell it, and helping it arrive in the hands of people from whom it has been basically taken over the years. That is a very costly strategy. It is very time-intensive, labor-intensive, so challenging by itself. That is one of the major reasons why South Africa is still swimming upstream in terms of its land reform. There has been a great deal learned over the first 20 years, and one can only hope that it will inform strategies going forward. One of the main learnings has been the need to create many kinds of support services and systems along the way to emerging farmers. So that's education, it's technical support, it's finance, and its connection to markets. The need to continue to nurture, not simply to fund and then leave, because often that is funding for failure if you do not accompany these small farmers as they grow. I just want to say, so it's not an instant success story. It's really an ongoing struggle and will require the education, the accompaniment, and the finance to make it work long term. Also the connection to corporate markets to buy those products and make sure that people have livelihoods. I just want to say one thing we did not touch on was the region, and I think looking towards the next 20 years in South Africa's economic and political life, it is critical to look at the region of Southern Africa, if not the continent as a whole. From the land perspective, there are many, many very critical issues that are raised. The one that's gotten the most publicity in the U.S. has been the question of Zimbabwe. Oh my goodness, are people going to have their land taken? That concern. But across another border in Mozambique, one of the major concerns right now is that of land grabs. Mozambique has got huge expanses of unworked arable land, and there are companies coming in. What will their role be, and what will be the benefit to small farmers to create value for the whole society? So the land question, while it has its particular focus in South Africa, has huge challenges for the region and needs to be considered in that context.
Professor.
AGOA, well, I'm working on an article actually that argues that two main things. It should be renamed the Africa Manufacturing and Management Act. Growth and opportunity are abstract words. Management and manufacturing are pretty concrete words, and that's where the focus should be. And the second point is we should view, in my judgment, Africa as one unit, and there should not be eligibility by country. It should be the entire continent is eligible to participate. Now that's probably a political long shot, a very long shot, but that's my answer to the question, basically.
On a finer point, on that issue of AGOA, I've had a long involvement with AGOA since its first inception, really. I think there is a political debate on South Africa's graduation. I do not think that it's the right move. I think South Africa is rapidly integrating itself with the rest of the continent. South Africa offers the opportunity of growing its value chain structure into neighboring countries. South Africa is an investor in other economies. South Africa is an engine of growth, and I think it needs to be the sort of the sort of apex of Southern Africa's export manufacturing environment. To exclude South Africa from AGOA, I think will not only inure to the detriment of South Africa, but it will inure to the detriment of countries in which South Africa will source, whether it be labor, technology, or raw materials. The fact that we would possibly exclude South Africa from AGOA because of chicken exports from the United States is, to me, absurd, and a politically absurd case. I think we need to push that South Africa relies upon 300,000 jobs, depending on the access to the American market, that it is a change agent for technology, for labor growth, and I think to exclude South Africa from that would be a travesty. So I think all of you who are in this room who have an interest in AGOA's extension and AGOA's expansion ought to be indeed on the table and making your voice known that South Africa should not be excluded from AGOA, because it not only will be a detriment to South Africa, it'll be a detriment to other African countries. But based on that last-minute editorial, I want to thank our panelists for what is a terrific panel. And welcome the rest of you, the next panel up here, because there will be no break.
Very lovely to share
Wonderful
with you.
comment.
It's a
Let's
good
get
thing you have
together.
all that stuff
Hey,
so distilled
let's
in
get
it.
together. I have a private equity fund, and we're looking at new
Articles.
technologies.
Are you?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
So give me a
Perfect.
shout.
I will.
Dick, thanks a lot.
Nice to meet you, man.
You too, and I will
Donna?
follow up with you.
Absolutely.
Do you have a card with you?
I do.
And
Right.
I've got something that
Thanks.
I'll send you an email on.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
And
It was
thanks
a
for the-
fabulous presentation.
thanks
All
for
of the
the-
presentations were
Thanks for the
terrific.
briefing on
Thank you
AGOA.
very
That's
much.
fabulous. I really appreciate it.
Wasn't that a great? That was fun.
Wow. Oh, yes. And do you have one?
No, I don't. I will
Okay, so
drop you an
yeah,
email. I've just moved.
Where
Yeah,
are you now?
I've just moved to Bethesda. Yeah, so we can have lunch and talk.
Beltway.
I'm very interested in what you're doing. Yes, I'll be here until the evening session as well. I think there is a function at 6 o'clock. Yeah, reception. I think it's here. Yes. Hello.
So much for your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Your business.